So we have a process topic that we're going to talk about next. And how we're going to do this is I'm going to go ahead and frame the discussion a little bit. I'm going to turn to the steering committee to share some information. Caleb Schaefer with EPA is going to provide some factual information that's related to the topic, and then we're going to move into a decision. So this section of the meeting is really what we were noticing you all about 3 weeks ago, that there is a decision to be made tonight. And the decision is focused on whether or not EVRAZ continues their membership in the collaborative group. So the steering committee tonight is going to ask the collaborative group whether or not they could support ending EVRAZ's membership based on the conversation that we're going to have. But it would also support EVRAZ to rejoin if they are able to reach full compliance at a later date. So we'll get to that question, but I wanted to give you a heads up at the beginning that that's the question that's going to be asked by the steering committee. And then I'll give you some information in terms of framing it. So as you know, EPA's council presented at the September collaborative group meeting that one of the performing responsible parties, EVRAZ, who is a collaborative group member, is out of compliance for non-payment with EPA's order for remedial design. So following that September meeting, the last time we saw you all, the steering committee wanted to know more about why EVRAZ was the only party out of compliance. So they invited EVRAZ to their November steering committee meeting to hear more. EVRAZ joined, and this invite to EVRAZ was for an explanation based on going back to the formation of the collaborative group and its purpose and intention. So when this group was formed, community leaders talked at great length about whether or not to invite PRPs to the group. Some were really for it and some were really hesitant. And they ended up landing on only to allow PRPs that have agreements with EPA and are acting in good faith into the space. So when EVRAZ and Schnitzer, who are both currently members of the collaborative group, asked to join the collaborative group, there was a bit of hesitancy because both of them have orders rather than agreements with EPA, but the steering committee still said yes to their membership. EVRAZ did attend and present on the compliance issues at the November steering committee meeting, and based on that, the steering committee is recommending that the collaborative group end EVRAZ's membership due to the non-compliance issue. So here to provide more information about why the steering committee is proposing this are its members, who I'm going to introduce in a moment. They're going to share a shared statement that they've co-created, followed by some remarks on some facts related to oversight costs by Caleb Schaefer with EPA. So after that, we'll go ahead and move into any informal response that EVRAZ has tonight to this topic. And then, of course, open it up for all of your questions and comments before we move into that decision-making space. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to the steering committee members, which are Charlotte McDonald, Cassie Cohen, and Sarah Taylor was going to make it tonight, but she's sick. So Cassie, I know you'll be covering her talking points, and Emil Freeberg. So I'll hand it over to you, Charlotte, to kick us off.
Thanks, Annie. I'm Charlotte McDonald. Good evening, collaborative members. I'm Charlotte McDonald. I'm a steering committee member for this group. Myself, along with the other steering committee members, spent the last few months thinking about EVRAZ's membership and have been concerned with their continued seat at the table. Although EVRAZ believes they are moving forward with remedial design in good faith, the steering committee is concerned by the fact that they have been sent several notices of non-compliance for non-payment by EPA with no resolution to date. EPA's letters were sent to EVRAZ on the following dates: May 22nd, 2020, July 27th, 2020, September 27th, 2021, and the last one on September 6th, 2022. This clarifies that EVRAZ has had adequate time over the last 2 years to find a resolution. Cassie, I'll hand it to you.
Okay. EVRAZ's non-compliance fines far exceed the amount that they originally owed to EPA for oversight fees. Their refusal to comply has also limited compensation to cover essential engagement for communities and tribes. Potentially responsible parties are expected to act in good faith with EPA by paying these dues. EVRAZ's noncompliance raises to us an environmental justice concern. I think, it poses that question and concern for other collaborative members as well.
I'm Emil Freeberg with the Willamette River Advocacy Group and this steering committee. Oversight costs for tracking PRP's cleanup processes are real and reasonable costs. Federal requirements for participation in the CERCLA process require responsible parties to fully cooperate and meet their obligation by paying fees that cover oversight costs accumulated by EPA. EVRAZ is required to fulfill their responsibility to clean up the pollution they created while conducting their business. If they renege on this obligation, these oversight costs are then paid by EPA, which is funded by individuals and other businesses' tax dollars.
Thanks, steering committee. So I know, Caleb, you were going to provide a bit of information on oversight costs, what they are, and a few other items.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. The steering committee asked me to provide 3 pieces of information. The first is what are EPA oversight costs and describe a little bit about them. 2, the non-compliance by EVRAZ and describe that. And 3, other parties that are working on remedial design within Portland Harbor and how they compare. So the first thing I was asked to provide was a little bit about EPA oversight cost. And EPA CERCLA, which is the statute that governs Superfund and what we use to implement our cleanup, along with the regulations, the National Contingency Plan, allows for costs associated with the oversight of PRPs to be fully recovered, and we call those response cost. And all the agreements and orders, including this EVRAZ's unilateral order, includes a provision to pay those response costs. It includes, those types of costs that are oversight costs are costs that the United States incurs for monitoring and supervising EVRAZ's performance of the work to determine whether or not that performance is consistent with the order. In reviewing deliverables, remedial design deliverables that we review and approve pursuant to the unilateral order, cost incurred with overseeing and implementing the order. So that includes things like EPA staff payroll cost, our contractor cost, travel costs, lab costs, when we do things like split sampling. And so EPA documents these costs, and we send out bills periodically, and this is the case for all PRP lead Superfund sites. So that's a little bit about what oversight costs are. Second thing I was asked to provide was more of a description of the non-compliance, and I think Charlotte did touch upon this, but there have been 3 instances, notices of non-compliance for not paying oversight costs in 2021 and 2022, and a 4th notice of non-compliance, which was failure to provide financial assurance. And financial assurance is another requirement at Superfund sites, which essentially puts money aside or access to money aside in case that party isn't able to complete their obligations. EPA can access those funds to complete the PRP's obligations. And so that is the 4th notice of noncompliance relating to EVRAZ that EPA has issued. Finally, the last thing I was asked to provide was how it compares to other performing parties, performing remedial designs. There are 16 PRP lead project areas, and 15 of those have all paid their oversight bills. There's no outstanding bills, and are in compliance with their enforcement instruments. So that covers the 3 things I was asked to provide, and I'll turn it back over to Annie. Thank you.
Thanks, Caleb. Okay. So I'm going to turn to EVRAZ and others in just a moment, but just wanted to kind of summarize, this is the ask today, and this is the why behind why the steering committee is asking you to potentially come to consensus on ending EVRAZ's collaborative group membership. So we, of course, also want to make space for EVRAZ to informally respond if they'd like to. And Debbie, who is normally the member at the table for the collaborative group on behalf of EVRAZ, unfortunately had a prior commitment for her son tonight. She wishes she could be here, but I know Annie Stefanik is here in her place as her alternate. So Annie, I wasn't sure if you wanted to have any type of informal response on behalf of EVRAZ.
Thank you, Annie. And actually, if it's okay, I'd like to, I'll say a few things first. This group is important to us. We care about our community. We care about your input in our remedial design. We want to be at the table with you all. And because of that, I've actually asked a member of our executive leadership team to be on the call as well. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to hand it over to Sean Kitchell, who is our VP of Safety, Health, and Environment, to best respond and address this.
Thank you, Annie.
And real quick,
sorry.
Sean, just real quick, I just wanted to make sure we have time. So if you don't mind just keeping it pretty brief, we'd really appreciate that.
Very much so, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity as well. And I do want to apologize for Debbie, who's the more familiar face of EVRAZ, for not being able to attend for personal reasons. To echo what Annie said, we take our environmental stewardship very seriously and our impact to the community. And we believe that this partnership that we have with the collaborative group really provides us with a better opportunity to serve the community as we work through the steps of the Superfund. With regards to our situation for compliance, I'd like to state that it's purely a legal issue with legal counsel's position on the EPA and the authority they have to continue for oversight costs on an ongoing basis. I do want to assure you that while we work through this legal discussion on the costs, that it will have no effect on our good faith efforts to continue our design work and keep the cleanup moving forward. This isn't the end to our discussion with the expected costs. We continue further talks and settlement negotiations with the EPA. Again, to be clear, we haven't stopped. We're actively continuing our efforts, working with and partnering. And as a PRP, we value and welcome the community input in our remediation efforts. So I want to say thank you. And then again, letting you know that we will be abstaining from the vote, obviously leaving the decision in your hands.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank
Yeah, thanks, Sean and Annie, and thanks for keeping it very brief and straightforward. So appreciate that. So want to make sure that everyone has space to just make comments and ask questions. Are people wondering more about why this is being brought forward? What are your thoughts? What are your which way are you kind of leaning and why? We'd love to hear from all of you as members tonight. And you can always just raise your hand, put it in the chat. Yeah, Erin.
Yeah, it seems to me fair to say that I don't think that EVRAZ should be a part of this group as long as they're not in compliance with the EPA. And then when that is straightened out, then they would be welcome to rejoin like other parties. But their legal issues are not really ours to delve into or of interest to me. So I would take the steering committee's recommendation and move forward with that.
Thanks, Erin. I see Beth's hand up.
Yeah, thanks for the information tonight. I was just wondering, is it possible to put something in the charter that states that if someone's out of compliance, they can't, and they're a member, then they can't make recommendations, but they can still be a part of the collaborative? That's just a thought as a way to sanction in a way, but not remove them. So what are thoughts about that?
I think the meetings are still public and they would be welcome to attend, but that doesn't, but if they're not in compliance, should they get a vote on things? And if they're not voting and they're not bringing forth any recommendations, then they are essentially a public observer rather than a member. That's my opinion.
Thanks, Beth and Aaron. Other thoughts on that response before I turn to Matt? So I think the question is, could they remain a member, just not a decision maker? And we always use the term decision maker instead of voting, since we do strive for consensus. And that's why I'm using different terminology. But just wanted to see what other people's thoughts were on that. And yes, good reminder that just because EVRAZ, if we were to end their membership, they would still be welcome to be an observer. And the proposal is also, if they are and become within full compliance in the future, they could rejoin. So that is how the proposal is currently written. Matt?
Yeah, I think fundamentally what we have is a legal dispute between a PRP and EPA. I'd be curious from Caleb if that happens very often under CERCLA. I think I know the answer. The bottom line is EVRAZ, like Schnitzer, has a rather unique perspective. We are existing industrial parties that are performing the remedial design, likely to perform remedies. We bring perspective as folks that have been involved in CERCLA for a long time and have had other cleanups, and I think that perspective is valuable. As an observer, I don't think EVRAZ has an opportunity to express and convey their experience as they would as a full-fledged voting member, and I think that needs to be taken into consideration.
So Matt, what would your recommendation be based on what you just said?
I would not eject them from the group.
Mhm.
I understand, for a group that calls itself a collaborative and advertises itself as a inclusive forum, I think we need the variety of voices in the group. Again, EVRAZ, their legal dispute, I'm no lawyer. I'm not going to weigh in on it. But we have the same concerns. There's a question under the statute as to whether being issued a UAO gives EPA the authority to recover costs short of suing the PRP. I think it's a simple legal question. EPA is not the arbiter of that decision. The PRP is not the arbiter of that decision. The court is, and I think that needs to play out. It's that simple.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, it sounds like you have a slightly different perspective, which is expected with this large of diverse voices in the room. And Beth proposed a potential alternative to the proposal. So I just want to put it back. We have about 5 minutes of the meeting left. So I want to put it back to the steering committee just to see if, based on any of this conversation, it changes your perspective at all, it further strengthens it. Would you like to, I'm assuming we'd like to still ask the question via poll tonight. So I just want to test that with the steering committee members, Charlotte, Emil, and Cassie. I see Charlotte's hand up.
When you proceed with the opportunity for collaborative members to vote and reach consensus, you will include the statement that we came up with, which allows for a clear path for EVRAZ to rejoin. So I hope that we did consider that, and I think that's really important. In fact, so I think that goes to Matthew's point that the voice of potentially responsible parties is very important, but the process is also extraordinarily important.
Any other members' feedback or comments? Yeah, Cassie.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Charlotte. Just, I guess, like, lots of intention in all of this process. And so we are acting in good faith as well to, say, hey, we do want industry and the PRPs to be included in this space on an ongoing basis. but we want, kind of the highest integrity possible, to stick with the protocols and, procedures that come with Superfund. Community gets dragged along with that process too. It's not easy for us. We have all sorts of impacts around that, but so we hope that EVRAZ considers, and Schnitzer Steel considers that compliance, full compliance, like to us, means that you all are acting fully in good faith, and that is sort of what makes a good collaborative space and membership in partnership with all the other stakeholders.
Thanks, Cassie. And I see Matt's hand up.
Yeah, it just seemed easier to raise my hand than to use the little icon. Just a real quick response. I would just ask folks to think about whether compliance means giving up your rights under the law, and I don't think it does.
So a lot of difference of opinions here. And I think the steering committee remains aligned. I see Emil's comment in the chat saying that she agrees with Aaron, and Aaron's typing something in the chat too. So I know folks can read those comments on their own. Since we are nearing the last minute of our meeting, I would like to go ahead and try to test consensus with folks just to see where people are at. So as a reminder, we do have to have 10 decision-making members here tonight in order to reach a consensus, in which we do. As a couple reminders, observers are asked not to take this poll. So if you are an observer and not a member, please do not take the poll. The poll is for members only that have been onboarded and have adopted the charter. Also, if you are a resource agency member that is decided to opt out of decision-making, please do not take the poll either. So that's most of the resource agency members. The way we're going to frame this poll is exactly how the steering committee has written the proposal. So I'll read it out loud. It's the steering committee proposes that the collaborative group ends EVRAZ's membership based on today's discussion and supports EVRAZ to rejoin as a member if and when they reach full compliance. And people will be given the options to be in agreement, which would move towards consensus, not in agreement, which would block this decision from moving forward, or they can abstain, which would not block consensus. If you decide to not be in agreement and block the reaching consensus, what we would ask you to do is then come to the steering committee meetings between now and March to try to work out another potential proposal with the steering committee members. And just so you know, those are once a month for an hour, third Thursdays. So want to make sure that that's understood. And one last thing, just because we haven't done a lot of decision making together, if Anna, if you could show the slide on consensus decision making, this is the process that we use. So what will happen now is the steering committee has made the proposal in the form of the poll, and then we just need someone to second that proposal. So the proposal that I just read out loud, does someone second that is the question.
I will second that.
Okay, thank you. And then what we would do is we move into the poll now. So we'll launch the poll. Again, only decision-making collaborative members, please submit either your support in agreement form, not in agreement, or abstaining. And so again, in agreement and abstaining from the decision does not block consensus, but not in agreement does block consensus. So we can go ahead and issue that poll. Are people seeing it? We'll give folks a few minutes. And I see the poll as well. Okay, so I so far see at least one person not in agreement. Who is that one person? I just want to make sure they are a decision-making member. That's Matt. Okay. And Matt, is there anything that could be changed in this proposal today to get you to either abstain or be in agreement with this proposal?
I just think it's inappropriate to eject a member who is trying to exercise their legal rights. Whether or not they're correct in their legal analysis, I think is beside the point. I'm not sure there's any way to change this to get me in agreement if it involves ejecting a member who is exercising their legal rights.
So it sounds like we can't modify, meet in the middle to find common ground on setting the legal issue aside and revising the proposal to help make it work for you. So what I'm going to suggest is that, Matt, we have you come to the steering committee meetings between now and March. So again, third Thursday with the steering committee members that were here tonight for an hour between 12 and 1. And we'll need to work on this together. And then what we'll need to do is revisit this conversation at the March meeting. Because we cannot move forward via consensus if we do not have every member in agreement.
A calendar invite would be welcome.
Yeah, of course, we will always send those. We always send agendas in advance as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll put that as part of our action items. And then let's see, I just want to make sure, I'm just going to look at my notes, see if I missed anything. Oh, we'll make sure that this is documented in the meeting summary. And then any last questions about this process or the next steps before we wrap up the meeting? Okay. So I'm going to pass it back to Alyssa to wrap us up and then get us moving into the breakout groups after that. Thanks, everyone.